Hello everybody and welcome to the ninth video in our series of videos on the Middle Ages. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes, so by the end of this presentation you guys should know four aspects of how the manor operated. Second, you guys should know what the difference was between a serf and a freeman and some features of their lives. And finally, you guys should be able to give an account of the Peasants Revolt. So in our very first video on the Middle Ages, we looked at the feudal system and how knights and lords were given fiefs known as manors. Today we will be looking more closely at the manors and the majority of the people who lived there, the peasants or serf, the bottom of the base of the triangle of the feudal system. So as we said before, the nobleman was the lord of the manor and he lived in the manor house, which was kind of like a smaller version of the castles we've already encountered. There was land there that he kept for himself, and this was called the demesne. They then rent the demesne, as we can see here. They then rented the rest of the land to the peasants. The manor usually had 3 open fields, and each peasant had a narrow strip of land in each field. They used what was called the open field crop rotation, where they would leave one of the fields fallow or they wouldn't put anything in it every year because they didn't want to drain it of its nutrients, and they didn't have the fertilizer to keep those nutrients in the land or minerals in the land either. They also had a place called the commons, which you can see down here, which is where everybody's animals grazed. And there were no fences in this, so diseases would spread quite rapidly among these animals if any diseases broke out. The peasants lived in pretty appalling conditions. You can see here they would share their houses with their animals and stuff like that. The walls would generally be made of something called wattle and daub. So wattle is this bunch of interwoven sticks which are then covered with a mud or a clay which is known as daub. The manor would also usually be located near a river, as you can see here, and there would be a mill sometimes built on the river. This was owned by the lord, and the peasants would have to pay to use this. Whatever price he wanted to charge, he could charge because they were forced to use his mill. They couldn't go to another one. And they would have to use that to grind the grains that they harvested from their fields into flour. There would also be a barn on the manor known as a tithe barn, and a tithe was a tax that everyone had to pay to the church. They would have to give 1/10 of their crops or their produce to the church, and it would be stored in this barn here. It was one of the reasons that the Catholic Church gets so wealthy is because they're getting 1/10 of everybody's things, and not only does it pay for the priests, but also they're making profits from these things as well. Finally, there was another person who lived on the manor called a bailiff, who had his own house, which obviously would have been bigger than the peasant's house, and he was in charge of collecting taxes and the rents off the freemen and making sure that criminals were brought to the court in the Great Hall. Now, there were 2 types of peasants in the Middle Ages, so there were the freemen and the serfs. Now, the serfs were owned by the lord and had to work for the lord for 2 or 3 days of the week, and they wouldn't be paid for this, and then they'd have to spend the rest of the time trying to make sure that they could grow enough food on the strips of land that they had to feed them and their family. The serf couldn't leave the manor without the lord's permission, and he even needed his permission if he wanted to get married. He'd have to ask the lord if he could get married. However, if a serf did escape from the manor and wasn't captured for a year and a day and he could hide away, he would become a free man. This was a very tricky thing to pull off. Again, there was very little chance of transportation at the time. It was difficult enough to survive when you had land without being on the run, and there would have been bailiffs out looking for it and stuff like that as well. So it was a very dangerous thing, and if you were caught, there would have been very severe punishments for it. So a freeman was our second type of peasant, and he rented his land from the lord, so he wasn't owned by the lord. He did still have to work for free for the lord, but he had to do less work, and he was free to kind of do as he wished. He could come and go as he pleased and stuff like that. A free man could become a serf. He would usually become a serf if he was unable to pay his debts. So one of the most famous incidents in the Middle Ages in England was something called the Peasants Revolt, and this took place in 1381 in England. So the landscape of England had changed massively after the Black Death, which we will be looking at in a later video. But the monarchy were demanding higher taxes to pay for their 100 Years' War, which we've looked at before. The 100 Years' War, they were fighting against France. And an official called John Bampton, he arrived down in the southeast of England to collect some of these unpaid taxes that people thought were unfair, and he ended up sparking a revolt. The revolt was led by Wat Tyler and a priest called John Ball. They stormed London, and they got promises or concessions from the King Richard II to reduce this taxation and also to abolish this thing of serfdom where people could be owned by the lords. Um, they they still were very angry. They raided the Tower of London and ended up killing the Lord Chancellor, who they blamed for the high taxes. He was the highest official in the land. This led to Richard II calling for a meeting. They agreed to meet in a place called Smithfield outside of London 2 days later, and violence erupted at this meeting. And no one knows exactly sure how, but Wat Tyler was murdered during this eruption of violence. Everyone thought that this could be the end of Richard, but he stalled the peasants long enough that they were surrounded by a militia army of around 7,000 men that came from London, and the peasants were eventually crushed. And Richard then reneged or went back on his earlier promises of abolishing serfdom and reducing taxation. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So by now you guys should know 4 aspects of how the manor was operated. You should know about the demesne, the open field system, fields being left fallow. You should know about the mills, the bailiffs on the land, and what the houses of the peasants might look like. You should also know some of the differences between the serfs and the freemen, and some features of their lives. And finally, you guys should be able to give an account of the Peasants Revolt. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video.